Hello, and thank you for joining me today for the Sage Intacct Spend Management Overview. My name is Linda Pinion, and I will be your host. Before we get into the solution presentation, let's talk a little bit about our agenda. We'll start out today by looking at some of the challenges of controlling spend. We'll then look at what you're about to see as the solution presentation. And then we'll finish up by looking at some key takeaways. When we think about the challenges that companies and organizations have today with spend, it's really more about making sure that we are good stewards of our money and also making sure that we are adhering to our budgets. And for many companies and organizations, the information flowing between what's being bought or purchased and the budget are non-connected pieces of information. The budgeting may be done in a completely separate system. It may be done on Excel. And there may not be a link between when someone gets ready to buy something to check to see if they actually have the money or the budget to make that purchase. In addition, what we typically see is the lack of a formal process for approval. In many companies and organizations, there's not a process defined as to who can do the purchasing, what happens when something gets purchased, what process does it flow? Is there any approval before that purchase order is issued to the supplier? That leads us to the next piece of the process, which is reconciliation. And that reconciliation is typically taking place after the fact. They've already made the purchase. The materials or equipment or whatever they were buying has already arrived. And now what we have is the liability to pay for those goods and materials. So making sure that it was an authorized spend is clearly after the material has already arrived. Along the way, we really don't have any visibility to what's going on. In a very disparate process, you don't have that place where you can go and determine where things are in the process. Has a purchase order been issued? Has an AP bill been received? So that lack of visibility also causes many other ripple effects when we're looking at controlling cost and spend. So what you'll see today is the setup and configuration of the application that we call spend management. We'll look at how you can see visibility into what is being spent at the time of entry. So when you are entering those transactions, that's when you want to have that visibility and know whether or not you're in good shape and you have the money in order to make that buy. I also want to introduce to you multiple ways to manage spend, and this may be something that you haven't thought about, and so I want to plant that seed today when you take a look at spend management. And then I want to remind you of how to use Collaborate, Sage Intacct Collaborate, to self-document your transactions. And this may be something that you saw maybe a couple of releases ago or even a couple of years ago because it's been around for a couple of years. However, you've forgotten about it or you haven't really taken the time to go ahead and turn that functionality on. So I want to remind you of it today because it certainly can be used here in spend management. Before we get into the setup and configuration, I mentioned that I wanted to talk to you for a moment about how you could control spend. And this whole workflow here came by way of a presentation that I gave to one of our customer meetup groups. And it was really around spend management. However, at the same time that we were talking about spend management, we had just turned on capabilities for AP bill approval. Now, we've always had purchasing approval. So for those of you who are using purchasing, you may be using the purchasing workflow for approval today. However, we have a lot of companies and organizations that for some items, and maybe entirely, they're not using purchasing. They're buying everything by picking up the phone, calling the vendor, and getting the material and just getting a vendor invoice. However, they still wanted to have some sort of an approval process. So sometime back, we released the ability to do AP bill approval. So what I want to do is I want to go around this wheel here and just touch on each one of these bullets and give you the condensed version of how you might want to think differently about controlling spend. So today, everyone has accounts payable. It's part of the core package. In order to utilize the AP bill approval, you do need to do some configuration. And that configuration is just that. You're going to go in and you're going to turn on some switches, and you're going to identify that you want to use bill approval. You're going to set up some approval policies, and you're then going to start using the bill approval in AP. So an AP bill is going to get entered, it'll get submitted for approval, it'll go through that approval routing, and once it's approved, then it'll be an approved AP bill, and it can move on into the payment flow and get paid. Very, very similar to what you're doing on the purchasing side if you're using purchasing in that manner today. So that's one way. The second way is through purchasing. And again, purchasing, sometimes people use purchasing for certain types of items that they're buying or a value of an item. So with purchasing, again, configurable, you're going to turn on that you want to use that workflow approval. There are some different transaction definitions that you might be using, a requisition versus a purchase order. You might have some sequences of approval, so some things may go through one type of process for approval and others may go through a different process. And that approval could even be based on a transaction amount. So purchasing, AP, both you can use the approval routing. When you want to lay an advanced or more sophisticated way of controlling spend on top of that, you then subscribe to spend management. And spend management works with general ledger, it works with accounts payable, and it works with purchasing. Within that configuration, which you're going to see in just a moment, you'll be able to turn on a warning or a hard stop. So what happens is, in the configuration, you determine when someone enters a transaction based on the configuration and the setup, if they do not have the money to make that purchase, what do you want Sage Intacct to do? Do you want it to stop and not allow them to go any further, or do you want it to just give them a warning? And we'll look at that when we go to that setup screen. The other piece to that is you can then notify the budget administrator when one of these types of transactions happen. So when someone tries to buy something and they are buying it in an over budget situation and they've been warned, then something can get sent via email to that budget administrator. There is, of course, a full audit trail here as well. So what happens is you have the ability to configure this, to look at that budget, and then see that visibility during your data entry. And again, we're going to look at that so you can connect the dots and see how that works. Now, the last bullet is really the one that is a suggestion. Again, you may choose to use one or more of these scenarios. So you may say, some things are going to go straight through AP, and I'm just going to use the AP bill approval. Other things, I need a more formal process. I do need to look at entering a purchase order and tracking it, maybe because, again, of the cost of the item or the specifics of the item that you're purchasing. I want to use that workflow approval. And then you may also need that advanced control of spend management. So the hybrid model really allows you to do all of this and to use it as you feel is best for your company or organization. So clearly, choose the process that works for you. And again, just making sure that you know all of your options that you can choose from. So let's take a look at the solution, and the way that we're going to start this is in spend management. So let's start out by looking at how we configure spend management. Now remember, spend management is a separate application, whereas accounts payable and purchasing are part of your core bundle. So this would be a separate configuration and a separate application. So one of the things that I mentioned was bouncing that buy or that request to buy against a budget. So when you configure spend management, you're going to point to a budget. So when I open up this drop down, these are all the budgets that I have in Sage Intacct that I can choose from to utilize in spend management. I also talked about notifications. So here's where you could turn on the notifications for over budget and who that budget administrator is and how often I want to get those notifications. I also talked a little bit about some validation. So this is going to work in accounts payable, it's going to work in purchasing, it's going to work in general ledger. And you also can include specific dimensions that you want to bounce this back against. And in my case, it's at the department level. I also have the ability to set those warnings or stops by application. So here's where I have said validate in a specific application, and then if the budget is exceeded, I get to choose between stop or warn. And then for some of you, you may be aware of this, and perhaps you're not, but Intacct has the ability to set up user-defined books. And a lot of our not-for-profit organizations are using what they call commitments. And prior to us having spend management, they would set up a book, a user-defined book called commitments. And so here, what we're allowing you to do is not only, when you look at that spend insight window, not only do you look at what the budget is and what you've already spent, so your actual, you can also include what you have committed to spend. So this is a choice, and you would then point to a user-defined book. In our case, we're pointing to our commitment book. And then what transaction definitions are in play here? I've set up a specific purchase order with spend management, and then our item GL groups, which, as you know, when you enter a purchase order, you're going to enter an item. Now, that item number may be for a non-inventory item, like office supplies. So within that item, you have a GL item group. And here's where we're mapping that GL item group in, so you can see that I, in fact, have an office supplies, and you'll see that. That's one of the transactions that I've entered today. So pretty simple to configure spend management, a few questions that you'll want to answer. And then let's take a look at purchase orders, one with a budget and one without a budget. So let's look at the one with budget first. And I've entered both of these so that you can kind of see the difference. One of them's already been processed through, the other one's in a draft mode. But this is a purchase order to ABC Office Supplies for some office supplies, $250. Once you have configured spend management and turned it on for that application, so remember you've got 3 applications that it works on, then you'll be able to see this little hyperlink here to show Spend Insight. And when we click on that, it's going to give us the math, basically. It's going to say, based on the department, and remember I said I was using the department as one of my dimensions for validation, the GL account, we saw that. Here's the budget for office supplies. Here's what I've already spent. Here's the committed amount, and here's how much I want to spend for this purchase. And this is my math of my funds available. So at this point, I still have money that I could spend. So if I entered another purchase order for office supplies, I would still be okay, provided I didn't go over $18,978. If I did, based on the configuration, it would either stop me or warn me. Now, to be fair, most companies that are using spend management are not setting this to a hard stop. They are setting it to a warning because the rationale is that people really do need whatever it is they're trying to order. What they're most concerned with is that someone's getting notified to let them know that that purchase has been made. So that notification can go out and you would be able to see that. But again, it's a choice that you make. If you don't want that transaction to go forward, then you would put that hard stop. So let's come back and let's look at one without a budget. And in that configuration, you may have seen if it doesn't have a budget, it just is going to put it as a 0. So now we've got a Spend Insight window here, and you can see that I don't have any budget. I have not posted any actual and no committed expenditures. This particular purchase is $100, and it's showing me $100 in the negative, and that's because I don't have any budget for this. So if I went ahead with this, it would generate a notification to the budget administrator. Again, if I have that hard stop on, it won't let me go any further. Those messages, by the way, come up at the top here. It's either a warning in yellow or it's a hard stop in red. So pretty simple for you to see that Spend Insight window, really to have that visibility to what's going on. I wanted to take just a minute and go into AP because I wanted to show you a couple of things. One is when you look at this, this is an AP bill, and you'll notice that there is, some Spend Insight window here, but there's also a collaboration feed, and that's what I really wanted to point out here at the bottom. Anytime you have a transaction, I happen to be in accounts payable, but this works in every one of our data entry screens, whether it's AR or AP, purchasing. If you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see that there is a collaboration feed and a collaboration dialog box. And remember that collaborate is what allows you to communicate with another Intacct user. And you communicate at the transaction level. When they get the message, they have a hyperlink right to that transaction. So here, I've just keyed in a message to Charla Grace and asked her to check out this invoice and make sure that it's correct for the new department that we're creating. From here, every conversation would be stacked. I would get to see the entire communication about this transaction. What I also have is the ability to put that collaboration feed onto a dashboard. And I like to do that because then I can see it when I log into my own role-based dashboard. So at this point, I am the controller. Here is that message about that accounts payable bill. It's hyperlinked. So when I get that message in my feed, I can click on that bill, and it's going to take me right to the transaction. And then I would have an opportunity to communicate back via the dialog box. So if you're not using Collaborate, I would encourage you to do that. So let's come back to our PowerPoint. Let's do a quick wrap up of spend management. So first off, spend management is going to give you the visibility and control of your expenses. Initially, this application was really requested by our nonprofit organizations. However, the analysts will tell you if you can reduce your spend by 5 to 10%, you can increase your bottom line by 2 to 3%. Other ways to look at it is every dollar that you save is a dollar that impacts the bottom line. So controlling spend is not for a specific vertical. It's for every type of company and organization. Who doesn't want to control spend? You can utilize Sage Intacct budgets in committed dollars. Remember, we looked at the committed book to determine your accurate spend insight, and it will do that math in the spend insight window for you. You can control spend as it relates to specific dimensions and entities. Again, part of that configuration and setup. And then just a quick reminder, you might want to consider using the hybrid model that I pointed out, where you're using not only AP bill approval and purchasing approval, you're laying that spend management on top of that, and you're getting that advanced control of what's being spent. You're able to have those notifications so that you keep on top of it, and you're making sure that you're staying within the guidelines of your company. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to talking to you next time.